Welcome to the Week 7 receivers. This is where it gets interesting. There are a lot of expensive guys in excellent spots, a lot of the names that you're used to as opposed to us pulling out of the hat a little bit at the running backs with all the injuries. But before we get there, we, of course, have a great offer for you in our free trial. This includes position rankings, projections, and premium cheat sheets and all the stuff you're used to. Let me get you this up on the screen. This is our RotoCurve free trial for Week 7 of the NFL season. Again, optimized DFS lineups with some of the stuff that I told you, which includes that I didn't mention, of course, red zone data and all of the wonderful things you're used to. Those lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel. You get all the stuff that me and all our great colleagues are writing for you, all our rankings, all that kind of stuff. So rotocurve.com/free trial for all the fantasy goodness your heart could desire without costing you a dime at this moment. Jim, let's talk about receivers because we especially if these injuries prove to be true at running back, we are spending up here, and we are spending up a plenty. I think we're spending up for at least two receivers in most of the formats. So why don't you tell me which of the guys are worth using?
Well, I mean, A.J. Green stands out, obviously. I mean, I know Joe Hayden had a little bit of resurgence, but we've actually seen receivers actually obviously start to perform.
He's also probably out, by the way, before you go there. Yeah, he injured, I think it was his groin last week in practice.
So he's been limited, I was going to say, since week 2, and now he's out, right? So
yeah, he re-aggravated, and he's listed as week to week.
There you go. Well, that's kind of his pattern. I mean, it sounds harsh, but he's been in and out of lineups for the last 3 years. So, you have a really choice matchup in that sense. Like we said, in the quarterback setup, Cleveland's given up 2 touchdowns every game for 9 straight weeks. That's incredible. I mean, that's the longest streak in the AFC, tied with Detroit for the longest in the league. So we can assume if they're massive home favorites, that some of that point share is going to go to A.J. Green, who has 28% of the targets in Cincinnati. So on pace for a monster year in every department except touchdowns. 1,600 yards, 110 receptions, stuff like that. I think here's the correction. I think he's a high floor guy to go get. I think there's an obvious argument to fade Antonio Brown because Landry Jones is in the situation, and even though game script actually could trend really pass heavy for Pittsburgh if they're down, there's no cost certainty with the price you have to pay for Brown, and the ceiling is unquestionably compromised, just because you can't really imagine him having a humongous game given the conditions. Another guy I'd like to pay up for, it's not as expensive as going with these guys, would be Brandon Marshall. It looks like Geno Smith's the guy now in New York. Brandon Marshall's had 40% of his targets, 40% of Smith's targets last year or attempts last year went to Marshall. I think there's really no reason why anybody else is going to have a strong market share. Quincy Enunwa has faded. He's not really an option. They have like 4 other options in there. Robbie Anderson, Devin Smith might come back. None of those guys matter. It's really just Brandon Marshall. I think the floor is super high here. And we've seen teams beat up on this Ravens secondary. It's not a very good pass defense at all. I think Marshall is a really chalky player in the sense that his floor is high, but I don't think he'll be chalky ownership-wise because people are going to avoid that quarterback situation. So I think that's interesting. I think we're all going to mention this guy, Jeremy Maclin. The Saints are just really still, obviously, the team to target. They've given up 2.66 points per drive. They're even worse on the road. It's almost 3 points per drive. And they've given up the most yards per game to receivers, 211 yards to receivers. So Maclin could easily have, a 100-yard game with a touchdown as his expectation, his median outcome. So, it's just a really good position to play. I think Maclin and Marshall are kind of your safer cash guys. Green's obviously safe in cash, but he also has an incredible ceiling. And then obviously I think you'll talk about this guy at some point, but Julio Jones is the guy to pay up for of all the guys, in fantasy this week. I just think setting up against, we talked about how soft the secondary looks for San Diego without, Jason Verrett, and Flowers is banged up as well. So, at home, it seems like you said it in the quarterback thing. Matt Ryan thing is for real. It's not. This isn't. We're 40+% of the way into the season, so we can start buying shares of what he's doing. So I just think all these veterans that I talked about are the guys that I'm going to build around. I'm not going to take many risks. In the tournaments, I have some guys that I'll mention that you can really pay down for. But I'd rather pay up at receiver this week. I really would. And go cheaper at quarterback with your Dalton or your Tyrod Taylor, preferably Dalton, and stack them with Green.
Yeah, I kind of suggested this in my chat room. I got a chat with a few of the other writers on RotoCurve, Josh Gross, Josh Kalachi, that if you're playing cash this week, I actually think it's a great idea to use, or at least go with most of your volume for Thursday night slate, because you can get Ty Montgomery and you can get Cameron Meredith. And I think those are two of the best wide receiver values of the weekend. So if you're playing cash games, I think you can fit everyone you want and go with at least one or two cheap receivers. And the best cheap receivers of the week are coming from that Thursday night game, especially Montgomery, who might be used as a running back as well. And what did he catch? Like 10 passes last week, something like that out of the backfield. I mean, he was quite active. He caught, 10 for 98. So I think him at minimum salary with Lacey listed as out and Cameron Meredith are the way to go. But let's assume you're playing the Sunday slate like most of us are. I think Julio Jones is where you got to start. You mentioned it. He's tearing up anyone who's not an elite corner. Him and Matt Ryan just on the same page. So I think Julio Jones is definitely a guy to spend up for. I think AJ Green makes a lot of sense. And I think if you have the salary and, if you're playing a Thursday night game or you're going to play Jack Doyle at tight end this week, I think there is a way to go with three big wide receivers and Murray. I think Allen Robinson's the third rung of those elite receivers this week, because if he doesn't get it done this week, there is really something wrong against an Oakland defense that's allowing all the yards to receivers. I think both him and Allen Hurns are in play. I think both could legitimately have 100 yards. This could be Blake Bortles' breakout game, but I think Robinson's a guy who's going to see, 13 to 15 type targets like he has been seeing. And this should be a game where he at least, is respectable in terms of his catch rate, which has been pretty bad. And we can argue whether that's him or whether it's Bortles or whatever. But I think Robinson is definitely a guy you want for cash games. And then if I'm spending down on the weekend, there's two guys who stand out to me. Pierre Garçon, I kind of tweeted it earlier this week that he's seen I think it's 18 targets. Yeah, 18 targets in the last two games. He's caught 11 of them for over 120 yards and a touchdown. And now they're playing this Lions secondary, which has just been, brutalized by receivers. He's only 3,700. So as a cash game floor, I think you're going to get 5 receptions from a team that's going to be passing a ton in Detroit. Hopefully they get down early and they just got to go to the air, because then Garçon's going to go way, way above his price tag. And if you don't like Garçon, how about Tyrell Williams against Atlanta? He will see a little bit of Trufant as a warning, but both him and Trufant move around the formation. He will see plenty of not Trufant, let's put it that way. And he's kind of their red zone guy in terms of their receiver. I know they throw to Hunter Henry a lot, but I think Williams is the best in terms of fantasy that this wide receiving core has to offer. I think against Atlanta, San Diego will find a way to get down at some point. They'll have to throw their way back in. So those are my cash options this week. Let's go to tournaments, because there's a lot to like this week. Who did you not mention in cash that you like for tournaments?
Yeah, actually, Garçon's one of them. I mean, I know his floor. So his floor, you kind of changed my mind there in a sense that his floor is high enough, I would think, for cash usage, especially in these PPR formats, because he's had 31% of the market share, like you said, over the last 2 games. And with Reed, not looking, very good in this situation, it seems like he can help satisfy some of those routes. So I like that. One guy that I like, he's got a variant kind of production pattern, because he's the deep threat. And it also hurts because Joe Flacco's banged up here. But if Flacco is active, this is contingent on Flacco being active. Mike Wallace is interesting because his price is still depressed. I know people are waiting for Steve Smith, but he didn't practice again today. So I just think, Wallace is averaging 15 yards or 15 air yards per target, longest in the team. We saw he was just inches away from a touchdown there against New York. He's the deep ball guy. I just think there's some interest in tournaments where he could be, especially in this setup against the Jets, who've given up the most deep plays in the league and are just, every single week you can scheme vertical passes against them. We see it every week. Another tournament guy that I like is actually Chris Hogan for New England. Pittsburgh's outside corners have been susceptible. They've given up the most yards per game to receivers over the last year, going back to the start of last season. And really, he's the lone deep threat, really, in terms of Tom Brady airing it out. I think this could be a situation where if he can get and the other thing too is there's no pass rush for Pittsburgh right now. They've got the second lowest pass pressure in the league. They're only pressuring quarterbacks on like 16 or 17% of dropbacks, which is really low. League average is like 25%, so it's significantly lower than even league average, which could, again, I mean, that goes into the factor of Hogan being able to get deep and being able to get deep into his routes. So I think there's some upside with Hogan that most people will be off him. He was fun that first week. He really wasn't part of the game plan last week. I just think there's kind of a return to upside here. And then if you really want to spend down, like the floor type stuff, Adam Humphries is kind of interesting. Vincent Jackson wasn't really a big factor anyway, but he did actually have a somewhat sizable target share, even though he wasn't doing much with it. He had a 20% market share in Tampa. We've seen Humphries. He had a 2-week stretch earlier in the season where he had 20 targets. I think, 8 to 10 targets, kind of like a really cheap Cole Beasley type game could occur. And we know that, playing San Francisco, you get those extended reps. And plus, Humphries is going to have an incredibly low, ownership factor. And then in general, he's just, kind of that PPR kind of mold where there actually is some floor built in here.
Yeah, I like all those options. I'm definitely on Humphries this week, but if we're mentioning Humphries, we got to mention Mike Evans.
Yeah.
As the top guy, I think a lot of people are going to be on him. I like him. I see the case for him. If we like Winston, the San Francisco defense, there's really nowhere where you can't attack them, especially with a true number one like Mike Evans. So I definitely like him this week. I mentioned Allen Hurns. I really do think this is Blake Bortles' return to what we came to know last year, where he's throwing for all kinds of yardage. I think both Hurns and Robinson get it done for you. Both are going to approach 100 yards, in my opinion. So I definitely like both. Amari Cooper's a guy who's gone over 100 yards in 2 straight, and this Jacksonville defense certainly isn't anything to write home about. But I do think that he's the one who draws the matchup against Amukamara, assuming he's active. I like both these receivers. I like Cooper and I like Crabtree. I think this could be a return to Crabtree kind of week. So I think that Cooper's going to kind of take away the ownership percentage. I think it's going to be a sneaky week where Crabtree, we come out of the week thinking, oh, Crabtree's the number one receiver, like we kind of were doing earlier in the season. So I think that's an intriguing one for me. And I'll give you a name that I don't think a lot of people are on this week. Certainly Odell Beckham is, worthy of consideration, but how about Victor Cruz for tournaments? This is a guy that I kind of have circled this week against this Los Angeles defense. And I'll tell you why. Their outside corners are pretty terrible. We're talking about EJ Gaines and we are talking about Troy Hill, or the guys who are starting out there. Now, their slot corner is grades as one of the top 15 best corners in the league, and that's where Sterling Shepard sees 90+% of his snaps. So let's theorize this. If we think that Sterling Shepard draws a tough matchup, I think that Los Angeles, having seen Beckham the last few weeks dominate, they're going to slide a safety over on top of him, which is going to leave Victor Cruz kind of free to roam against a bad cornerback, and I think that could translate to a big GPP type, maybe even play. That's all you need from Victor Cruz is one false step from the corner. Yeah, so I've got him circled as a guy that I don't think there's going to be even 2% ownership on him. But there's a strong case to be made for Victor Cruz in tournaments this week. And the other guy I like, where we'll go back up in terms of price, is T.Y. Hilton. With no Dwayne Allen and with Philip Dorsett nursing, I think it's a hamstring injury, they pretty much have to go to Hilton early and often, and no one in the Tennessee secondary scares me. So those are my tournament guys this week. Did we miss anyone at receiver?
Just one guy would be Brandon Cooks. I talked about pressure rates. I mean, Kansas City has the lowest pressure rate in the league. Last year they had a great pass rush. No Justin Houston. Tamba Hali is just too old. They really have no pass rush at all. Like I said, 32nd in the league in pass pressures, which is, a hit, Harry, or sack per drop back. So I just think there could be time for Breeze to operate. I know Breeze hasn't been great on the road. He's averaging almost half the fantasy points on the road versus home over the last year. But I think Brandon Cooks is a guy who, can get deep. And I think if they are down, there's some garbage time there. Obviously, people know about him. He had a career high in yardage last week, but the price really isn't so incredibly high. He's still in those mid-7s. It could be one of those weeks in tournaments where you get an Evans, you get a Cooks, and you kind of roll the dice on these huge play guys as opposed to maybe paying for the floor.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's going to be a nice week to differentiate. It will be interesting. I don't think you're winning $1 million this week with AJ Green, Julio Jones, and Robinson, like I suggested.
Right.
I think you're going to have to mix and match. So, will be interesting. But that's all for us in terms of receivers today. Just want to remind you about the free trial. That, of course, rotocurve.com/free-trial. You get week 7, all the wonderful things you like with the RotoCurve football package, rankings, projections, cheat sheets, DVP rankings, points per attempt, red zone. You get the optimized lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel. You get access to player ownership percentage. So go ahead and check that one out. Jim and I will be back with the final video of the week, which was actually money for you guys last week if you listened to us. Jim and I really nailed those stacks, so stay tuned.